In the first two chapters, Deleuze approached the concepts of difference and repetition from without as conceptual representations. Then, in chapter 3, he made, as we have seen, a forceful critique of representation. So the challenge now is to think difference as a presentation, that is, to make the difference, as Deleuze says. But how can we do this? Is it even possible? As we will see, the answer is to think difference in terms of duration. We are now entering the theatre in which the interiority of movement is found, as Deleuze said in the introduction. The main focus of chapter 4 is the idea with a capital I. It is the universal and concrete ground for our knowledge, the place where the ideal synthesis of difference occurs. As Deleuze says, ideas present three moments, undetermined with regard to their object, determinable with regard to the objects of experience, and bearing the ideal of an infinite determination with regard to concepts of the understanding. The object of the idea is not material reality or the self, but it is rather what Deleuze calls the problem, something that forces us to think, like Socrates, a temple, or a demon. And what we are forced to think is not the thing directly, but the sufficient reason that brings the thing about, ideally and materially. The sufficient reason of a thing is its individual concept, it's the presentation of the thing's genesis. And just like the idea, the sufficient reason has three aspects. Just as determinability pointed towards reciprocal determination, so the latter points towards complete determination. All three form the figure of sufficient reason in the threefold element of quantitability, qualitability, and potentiality. This chapter addresses the question of how sufficient reason unfolds in time and gradually forms the idea. So we can divide it in two parts. In the first part, Deleuze addresses the problems of truth and distinction of ideas. In the second part of the chapter, Deleuze considers what he calls the adventures of ideas, namely their origin, their relations, and, since ideas are virtual, their relation to the actual. Let us explore the first part of the chapter. The truth is not found in truthful statements, but it's found in our ability to formulate problems. To formulate a problem means to find the sufficient reason of a thing, and the best model for this process is found in calculus, which Deleuze develops extensively in many of his writings, notably because of its symbolic power. As Deleuze says, the symbol dx appears as simultaneously undetermined, determinable, and determination. Three principles which together form a sufficient reason correspond to these three aspects. A principle of determinability corresponds to the undetermined as such, dx and dy. A principle of reciprocal determination corresponds to the really determinable, dy over dx. A principle of complete determination corresponds to the effectively determined, values of dy over dx. The symbol dx has no actual reality, but it has a virtual existence which allows it to determine a very central concept in philosophy and mathematics, namely continuousness or continuity. Since it is such an important theme in all of Deleuze's writings and in his thought, let us examine the most relevant aspects of calculus. In mathematics, continuity simply means that given a function like f of x equals x squared, you can attribute a value to each value of x on the y-axis. It means that each point on the line of numbers can be determined. This may be very straightforward for numbers like 1, 2, 3, or even for fractions like 1/2 or 5/3. But a problem arises with so-called irrational numbers that cannot be represented by a natural number or by a fraction. This is a big problem because such numbers occur everywhere. For example, in pi or square root of 2, in fact there are far more irrational numbers than any other type of numbers. And their characteristic trait is that they have no assignable end, they go on forever. So the problem is this: if these numbers go on forever, how do we know that they have an actual value? How do we find this value? How do we determine the specific value of a number that goes on indefinitely? Let's take a practical example. How do we attribute a value to pi in the function f of x equals x squared? One way to do this is to go by approximation. I can begin at 3, and then, nudge by nudge, fraction by fraction, approach pi. I know that in this function 3 gives me a value of 9. If I add pi's first decimal, 0.1, I get a little closer to the value that I'm looking for. Then, if I add the second decimal, I get even closer, etc. You see, whenever I add a decimal, what I do is that I reduce the size of this triangle, which represents the scope of my approximation, and its value is given by the triangle's slope. In order to get the exact value of pi, what I need is to reduce the size of this triangle to a very small value, which means reaching the value of the slope of the tangent at the exact point that I'm seeking. The beauty of calculus is that this is precisely what we become able to do. The mathematical justification for this is the following. The way to calculate a slope is rise over run, or how much I climb relatively to my horizontal movement. Now, suppose I have a value of x which is arbitrarily close to the value that I'm seeking. Arbitrarily close means that it's not equal to 0, but it approaches it, which in mathematics is represented by the symbol dx. The slope of the corresponding triangle is therefore arbitrarily close to the slope of the tangent that I seek. I become able to calculate it as follows. This value, the rise, is called dy. It is equal to the difference between f of x, which is this point, and f of x plus dx, which is this point. The corresponding run is simply dx. So the slope of a triangle which is arbitrarily close to the exact value that I seek is rise over run, or dy over dx, which is equal to f of x plus dx minus f of x divided by dx. In the case of the function f of x equals x squared, this means that f of x plus dx is equal to x plus dx squared minus f of x, which is equal to x squared divided by dx. If I develop the function, I get this, the dx simplifies, and since dx tends towards 0, it is as small as I want. And finally, the value of dy over dx is equal to 2x. Here is where the magic occurs. This means that even though dx and dy tend towards 0, when you put them in relation, you obtain an actual and exact value. The slope of the tangent of x squared at pi is equal to 2 pi, which means pi does actually have an assignable value for this function. In this case, something like 9.8696, etc. With this technique, you can study the continuity of any function between 2 points. Here is the bottom line. While both dx and dy tend towards 0, if I put dx and dy in relation in the function dy over dx, I obtain an actual value. Isn't this fantastic? This is central for Deleuze's understanding of difference, because indeed dx and dy define the first moment of sufficient reason, qualitatibility, which in the case of mathematics is the number line or the domain of the function. But what about continuousness in philosophy, you may ask? Well, Deleuze says this. Continuousness truly belongs to the realm of ideas, only to the extent that an ideal cause of continuity is determined. Taken together with its cause, continuity forms the pure element of quantitability. It is the cut which constitutes the next genus of number, the ideal cause of continuity or the pure element of quantitability. This means that the relation dy over dx cuts the line of numbers, and continuity is defined by these cuts. In philosophy, the line that is cut is not the line of numbers, but it's the line of time. The cut itself, the philosophical dy over dx, is a minute difference, an affection, which determines a duration. The duration is the time it takes to form a concept, you could say, or to obtain an idea. In other words, out of the quantitative element emerges a quality. As Deleuze says, for this reason, a principle of reciprocal determinability as such here corresponds to the determinability of the relation. The effectively synthetic function of ideas is presented and developed by means of a reciprocal synthesis. The relation dy over dx produces a field of solutions for all actual values of the function, and this is where complete determination, or the third aspect of sufficient reason, becomes apparent. This is where the quantitative aspect appears and gives way to potentiality. A principle of complete determination corresponds to this element of potentiality. It concerns the value of a relation, in other words, the composition of a form or the distribution of singular points which characterize it. For example, when the relation becomes null, infinite, or 0 over 0. The complete determination of a problem means that we understand the specificity of the problem, its conditions of apparition. But these conditions are not external to the problem. This is to say that the truth is no longer an instantaneous revelation by which we know the essence of a thing, as for Plato. It becomes rather a gradual process. This, as Deleuze says, is a revolution in philosophy and thought in general, one that is a more considerable revolution than the Copernican, meaning Kant's transcendental philosophy. The truth of a problem, therefore, is a gradual process by which we discover the singularities which express its conditions, the way in which the problem is expressed, and the progressive determination of the solutions. This process Deleuze calls learning. While knowledge refers to a state, learning takes time. A problem can only be discerned part by part. It's an eminently temporal process, and as Deleuze says, the objectivity of the problem is what we do not yet know about it. But this leads to a new question. Indeed, if problems are the objects of ideas, and since there is a potentially infinite number of problems, does this mean that there is an infinite number of ideas? Or is there just like one super idea that differentiates forever? This is the topic of the following section. In order to understand why Deleuze addresses this issue in the way that he does in Difference and Repetition, we need to understand a little bit about the context in which he was writing. France in the 1960s was the theater of serious disagreements in politics as well as in philosophy. In philosophy, thinkers were at each other's throat, fighting bitterly to impose their views. Each side was determined to win at any cost, for the prize was nothing less than the final word about the real nature of our human experience. So a fight for total academic domination was underway. Some would say it was a bit over the top. But one thing for sure was that each side was determined to win. On the one hand, there was the structuralist group, who were mostly objectivists. They argued that the truth of our experience, the origin of consciousness, is to be found in the hidden structures of thought, which, they believed, could be modeled after linguistic structures. Their great predecessor was Louis-Ferdinand de Saussure, the founder of modern linguistics. For the structuralists, being is fundamentally a formal entity, which can be represented logically. On the other hand, the phenomenologists and existentialists believe that experience does not derive from structures, but has its own value. Experience is not something that happens to consciousness, but rather, they argued, consciousness is always and already the consciousness of something. They were not philosophical idealists, but their views clearly tended towards a form of subjectivism. Their great predecessor was Edmund Husserl, one of the main founders of phenomenology. For them, being is fundamentally intentional, meaning that it can be represented as a relation. The battle between these two groups was merciless, and as they failed to reach an agreement, they did the unthinkable. They removed their shirts. As the battle went from bad to worse, a seemingly infinite series of argument after argument after argument was served. When Deleuze arrived on the scene, he managed to immediately understand the problem. He saw that both sides were making the same mistake, namely grounding their argument in identity or representation. So he took the high ground. I could go on with this forever. He chose reconciliation, a middle ground between the two schools, which is why he offered arguments such as the following. Structuralism seems to us the only means by which a genetic method can achieve its ambitions. It is sufficient to understand that the genesis takes place in time, not between one actual term, however small, and another actual term, but between the virtual and its actualization. In other words, it goes from the structure to its incarnation, from the conditions of a problem to the cases of solution, from the differential elements and their ideal connections to actual terms and diverse real relations which constitute at each moment the actuality of time. This implies that there is not one idea, but there are many. In this sense, Deleuze makes the idea an ontological determination, which is not just about what we think, but it's really about how things are. Consider the following quote, for example. There are ideas which correspond to mathematical relations and realities, others which correspond to physical laws and facts. There are others which, according to their order, correspond to organisms, psychic structures, languages, and societies. These correspondencies without resemblance are of a structural genetic nature. Just as structure is independent of any principle of identity, so genesis is independent of a rule of resemblance. So if Deleuze manages to reconcile structuralism and phenomenology, it is by rejecting the primacy of identity and replace it with what he calls a calculus of problems. At this point in the text, Deleuze takes three examples: atomism in Epicurean philosophy, biology, and social ideas. I think they are meant to show how the structural genetic correspondences work. Some indeterminate virtual term, like the X or the atom or small bones or the plebeian who works and possesses things, determine a certain continuity in time, a duration, a reciprocal relation. Something like the clinamen, biological organization, or social institutions, which in turn make up the physical world, the organism, or society respectively. Which is to say that there is a distinction between ideas, but this distinction is not found in the actual terms of a problem. Rather, ideas must be distinguished alongside three axes. On the first axis, we can distinguish ideas according to the differential fields that they express, such as biology, mathematics, linguistics, etc. On the second axis, we can classify the cases. For example, the cases of a conic figure that cuts a plane, or the many ways in which organs can fold in order to form an organism, or the variety of languages, etc., etc. On the third axis, we can differentiate between axioms that unify a field, mathematic or economic or linguistic axioms, some of which may overlap between fields. This space forms 1,000 planes or plateaus on which differentiation occurs. It is the ground on which we can distinguish ideas, and which Deleuze calls perplication. Perplication designates the distinctive and yet coexistent state of ideas that change all the time. This is why Deleuze explains that the formulation of a problem implies very practical questions. Once it is a question of determining the problem or the idea as such, once it is a question of setting the dialectic in motion, the question what is X gives way to other questions, otherwise powerful and efficacious, otherwise imperative. How much, how, and in what cases? The traditional question what is X was part of Socratic irony, and Deleuze sort of low-key marks Hegel for his lack of humor. From this point of view, Hegel is the culmination of a long tradition which took the question what is X seriously, and used it to determine ideas as essences, but in so doing substituted the negative for the nature of the problematic. Because ideas change, in the sense that they can be expressed in many different problems, it means that problems are in fact events. The gradual formation of a problem, which is learning, supposes an encounter between two series, the dx's and the dy's as they are put in relation, one which is real, the other ideal. And the process by which we put them in relation is Weiss-diction, which allows us to determine the conditions of the problem, that is, a certain distribution of singularities, and then to condense them in order to form a new idea. So, in summary, as against the immediate knowledge of essences, Deleuze has opposed the gradual determination of the problem. As against abstractness, he has defined the conditions of a problem as a certain distribution of singularities. And against the notion of ideas as inspirations, he presents them as condensation of singularities. This leads us to the second part of the chapter, which addresses practical and exciting questions about ideas, namely their origin, how they determine objects, and how they actualize themselves. All of this is what Deleuze calls the adventure of ideas. A classical structuralist view would argue that our ideas originate in the unconscious, where certain inevitable problems are waiting to be realized, such as the Oedipus complex. But Deleuze argues on the contrary that the unconscious is not the origin, but the effect of the problems that we are forced to think. And while these problems are inevitable, or as Deleuze says, imperative manifestations of being itself, the questions they create are neither necessary nor possible, but they have a certain modality which Deleuze calls, following Nietzsche, the dice throw. The imperatives are those of being, while every question is ontological and distributes that which is among problems. Ontology is the dice throw, the chaosmos from which the cosmos emerges. The dice throw does not refer primarily to statistical randomness. Rather, it means a certain power of affirmation, the affirmation of difference through repetition. This is why there is no ground for our ideas. Rather, the origin is a universal ungrounding, the movement of actualization of being itself. So Deleuze says, if being is above all difference and commencement, being is itself repetition, the recommencement of being. Repetition is the provided of the condition which authenticates the imperatives of being. This is the constant ambiguity of the notion of origin and the reason for our earlier deception. Origins are assigned only in a world which challenges the original as much as the copy, and an origin assigns a ground only in a world already precipitated into universal ungrounding. The universal ungrounding is the element in which difference is repeated. This implies a certain field in which the virtual can be actualized, which Deleuze defines as follows. We call the determination of the virtual content of an idea differentiation, with the T. We call the actualization of that virtuality into species and distinguished parts differentiation, with a C. The TC variation is linked to the reciprocal determination of calculus, dy over dx, a universal ungrounding in which difference or the dice throw can be affirmed, that is, fixated in duration. So a new problem occurs. How can the object be determined in space and time? We have seen that sufficient reason presents in its third moment the complete determination of the object. But this determination is still virtual. The object has not yet acquired its material reality, as it were, which means that the complete determination of sufficient reason does not, in fact, comprise the existence of the real object. So a paradox appears, which Deleuze formulates as follows. How then can we speak simultaneously of both complete determination and only a part of the object? The determination must be a complete determination of the object, yet form only a part of it. His solution is to use Descartes' distinction between complete objects and entire objects. Following suggestions made by Descartes in his replies to Arnaud, we must carefully distinguish the object insofar as it is complete and the object insofar as it is whole. What is complete is only the ideal part of the object, which participates with other parts of objects in the idea, or the relations, or the singular points, but never constitutes an integral whole as such. What the complete determination lacks is the whole set of relations belonging to actual existence. In this way, the object may be ens omni modo determinatum, as the scholastics say, that is fully determined without having any actual existence. In order to be actualized, we need the notion of differentiation, where a back and forth between actuality and virtuality occurs. The time that it takes for an object to be actualized and become whole is a purely logical time which produces a rhythm, like a heartbeat, which repeats the object. By virtue of this progressivity, every structure has a purely logical, ideal, or dialectical time. However, this virtual time itself determines a time of differentiation, or rather rhythms or different times of actualization, which correspond to the relations and singularities of the structure and, for their part, measure the passage from virtual to actual. This is the movement of life itself. It's the real movement that we were looking for. Difference and repetition in the virtual ground the movement of actualization, of differentiation as creation. They are thereby substituted for the identity and the resemblance of the possible, which inspires only a pseudo-movement, the false movement of realization understood as abstract limitation. So if differentiation constitutes the field in which difference and repetition occur, Deleuze must now focus on this actualization itself, which is the topic of our next part. Of course, the remaining question is this: how does actualization itself occur from the entire to the whole object? Deleuze takes embryogenesis as an example, and he presents the problem as follows. Take a division into 24 cellular elements endowed with similar characteristics. Nothing yet tells us the dynamic process by which it was obtained. 2 times 12, 2 times 2 plus 2 times 10, or 2 times 4 plus 2 times 8, etc. This matters not just because it's the history of the thing, but because it implies a certain organization of space, and of a space that is also interior, as exemplified by the embryo. It is the creation of space in a more or less contracted time, and the nature of this space depends on how it came to be. This process in which a complex idea, in relation with other complex ideas, forms an interior space in relation with the outside, like the stage of a theater, is called dramatization, and it implies the spatialization of time. As Deleuze says, not only do these spaces begin to incarnate differential relations between elements of the reciprocally and completely determined structure, but the times of differentiation incarnate the time of the structure, the time of progressive determination. Such times may be called differential rhythms, in view of their role in the actualization of the idea. It is as dramatization that the actualization of the whole object implies time. So we must now study the process of dramatization more in depth, and this will be the object of the next and final chapter of Difference and Repetition, which we'll study in the next video. Thank you very much for watching this video, and a special thanks to my patrons and the people who support this channel. Thanks to your donations, I can produce these videos at no cost. It allows me to pay for software and the occasional cup of coffee. It's sincerely appreciated. If you would like to support this channel as well, you can subscribe to my Patreon or make a donation on Ko-fi, links in the description. Your support really makes a difference. For now, thank you for watching and see you soon.